Good morning, Sangha. It's good to see you all this morning. We will begin our service this morning with the Three Refuges. If you don't have them memorized, you should have a chant booklet available to you, and it is on page 7. So we will begin with the Three Refuges. I go for refuge to Buddha, my deeply awakened mind, the living source of understanding and compassion, which must be cultivated to be known fully. I go for refuge to Dharma, the path of mindful living, leading to healing, joy, and enlightenment, the way of peace, which must be cultivated to be known fully. I go for refuge to the Sangha, the loving and supportive community of practice, realizing harmony, awareness, and liberation, which must be cultivated to be known fully. I am aware that the three jewels live within my heart. I vow to realize them. I vow to understand living beings and their suffering. I vow to cultivate loving kindness and compassion and to practice joy and equanimity. I vow to live simply and sanely, content with few possessions, and to keep my body healthy. I vow to let go of all worry and anxiety in order to be light and free. I am aware that I owe so much to my parents, teachers, friends, and all beings. I vow to be worthy of their trust, to practice wholeheartedly, so that understanding and compassion will flower, and I can help living beings be free from their suffering. May the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support my efforts. May the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support my efforts. May the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support my efforts. Now we will move on to the Heart Sutra. We will begin and end with the name, the Maha Prajnaparamita Hridaya Sutra. The Maha Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. The Bodhisattva of great compassion, from the deep practice of Prajna Paramita, perceived the emptiness of all five skandhas and delivered all beings from their suffering. O Shariputra, form is no other than emptiness, emptiness no other than form. Form is emptiness, emptiness form. The same is true of feeling, thought, impulse, and consciousness. O Shariputra, all dharmas are empty. They are not born nor annihilated. They are not defiled nor immaculate. They do not increase nor decrease. So in emptiness, no form, no feeling, no thought, no impulse, no consciousness, no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, no form, sound, smell, taste, touch, or objects of mind, no realm of sight, no realm of consciousness, no ignorance, nor extinction of ignorance, no old age and death, nor extinction of them, no suffering, no cause of suffering, no cease from suffering, no path to lead out of suffering, no knowledge, no attainment, no realization, for there is nothing to attain. The Bodhisattva holds on to nothing but prajna paramita. Therefore the mind is clear of any delusive hindrance. Without hindrance there is no fear. Away from all perverted views, one reaches final nirvana. All Buddhas of past, present, and future, through faith in prajna paramita, attain to the highest perfect enlightenment. Know then the prajna paramita is the great Dharani, the radiant peerless mantram, the utmost supreme mantram, which is capable of allaying all pain. This is true beyond all doubt. Proclaim now the highest wisdom, the prajna paramita. Gate, gate, para gate, para samgate, bodhisvaha. Gate, gate, para gate, para samgate, bodhisvaha. Gate, gate, para gate, para samgate, bodhisvaha. The Maha Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. So before we begin today, the Dharma talk, the title of which is The Enticing Delusion of Ego. I have to tell you that this is probably one of the longest Dharma talks that you will ever hear. And I say that unapologetically because the content is very important to those of us on the Buddhist path. and we have a lot of points to address. So get yourself a cup of coffee, large glass of water, OJ, milk, caffeine-free Diet Coke, whatever floats your boat, and be prepared. Now, since about 1920, it is difficult to address this concept of ego without considering two different individuals. One, Dr. Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychology, and the Buddha. For purposes of clarification, let's begin with Freud, move on to the Buddha, and we are going to end this Dharma talk with some discussion on social justice. Now, this first part, having spent my career as a psychologist, this first part comes from a lecture I gave when I was teaching psychology at Grand Rapids Community College. So bear with me if I am temporarily in teacher mode. So, Freud. In 1923, Sigmund Freud, who is rarely pictured without his signature cigar, defined the psyche, the human psyche, as being structured into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego, all developing at certain stages of our life as systems. Now that's important because systems are not part of the brain, and they are not in any way physical. Synonyms of these three are the id as our basic instincts, the ego as our individual reality, and the superego as morality. Now, I often jokingly refer to these three as the ego is what we call the self, with the id being the devil standing on this shoulder, and the superego being the angel sitting on this shoulder. And there's that little Chinese story about the grandfather talking to his grandchild about the very vicious tiger, and that the tiger, wanders around in the wilderness, and well, there are more than one tiger, and one tiger is very adept at killing, the other is more friendly, and the grandchild asked the grandfather, well, which one wins, the friendly one or the unfriendly one? And the grandfather wisely says, whichever one you feed the most. So the id, according to psychoanalytic theory, is the very primitive and instinctual part of the mind. Okay. Sorry, that was my Alexa talking back to me. I think I better turn my phone off. There we are. Alexa will not talk back to me anymore, explaining what the id is. So the id is the primitive and instinctual part of the mind that contains sexual and aggressive drives and hidden memories. Now the superego operates as a moral conscience, and the ego is the realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and the superego. Now, although each part of the personality comprises unique features, they interact to form a whole, and each part makes a relative contribution to an individual's behavior. Now, the id, being the primitive and instinctive component of the personality, it consists of all the inherited or biological components of personality present at birth, including the sex or life instinct that we call eros, and the aggressive or death instinct that we call thanatos. It is the impulsive and unconscious, that's very important. It is the impulsive and unconscious part of our psyche and responds directly and immediately to all of our basic urges, needs, and desires. The personality of a newborn child is 100% id. And only later does it develop an ego and superego. Now, here is a very, very important point. The id remains infantile throughout our entire lifespan and does not change with time or experience, as it is not in touch with the external world. The id is not affected by reality. It is not affected by logic. It is not affected by the everyday world, as it operates within the unconscious part of our mind. The id operates totally on the pleasure principle, which is the idea that every wishful impulse should be satisfied immediately, regardless of the consequence. When the id achieves its demands, we experience pleasure, regardless of the consequences, and when it is denied, we experience unpleasure. The id engages in primary process thinking, which is primitive, illogical, and fantasy-oriented, having no comprehension of objective reality, and is wishful and selfish in its very nature. That's the id. Now let's talk about the ego for a bit. The ego develops as a mediator between the unrealistic id and the external world, ideally working by reason. The id operates according to the reality principle, working out realistic ways of fulfilling the id's demands. Now, this is an especially important point here. Working out realistic ways of satisfying the id's demands, often compromising or delaying, postponing satisfaction to avoid negative consequences. Considering, but not often adhering to, social realities, norms, etiquette, and the rules in deciding how to behave. All the while, the ego is working on behalf of the id. Like the id, the ego seeks pleasure and avoids pain. But unlike the id, the ego is concerned with devising a realistic strategy to obtain that pleasure. Ego also has no concept of right or wrong Something is good simply because it achieves the end means of satisfying without causing harm to itself or the id. Now take note, with both the id and the ego, there is no mention here of concern or care for other human beings. Often the ego is very weak and relative to the very headstrong id. Never underestimate the strength of the id. So the best the ego can do is try to stay connected to the id, pointing the id hopefully in the right direction and claiming some credit at the end as if the actions taken were its own, the ego's own. If the ego fails in its attempt to use the reality principle and anxiety is experienced, unconscious defense mechanisms take over and ward off at any expense unpleasant feelings or make good things better for the individual. Again, no mention at all of care or concern for anything other than the self. Whose function, it also has the function of trying to persuade the ego to turn to moralistic values, goals, rather than simply realistic. Moralistic rather than realistic. Now the superego consists of two systems. Two systems, the conscious and the ideal self. Think about those two things, the conscious and our ideal image of the self. The conscience can punish the ego through what? Through guilt. Have any of you ever experienced guilt over anything? If you haven't, you're a psychopath. Just saying. Okay. The ideal self is an imaginary picture we have of how we ought to be, and it also represents our career aspirations, how to treat people, and how to behave as a member of society. Behavior which falls short of the ideal self may be punished by the superego by means of guilt. Ah, man, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have said that. If a person's ideal self is too high of a standard, then whatever the person does will be experienced as failure. Now, the ideal self and conscience are largely determined in childhood from parental values and how we were each raised, how we were brought up. So with these concepts in mind, we can see the draw of achieving id-driven pleasure and avoiding unpleasantness by way of the ego. All right, enough of the psychobabble. Let's move on to what the Buddha's thoughts are on the concept of ego. Now, I'm going to read a series of quotes from scripture, sutras, and other Buddhist teachers to help us get a sense of why the elimination of the self-satisfying ego is important along the Buddhist path. Excuse me. We used to have jars of these things around the temple. I always loved them. I always took a handful, put them in my pocket. There is no fear for one whose mind is not filled with desires. That reminds me a lot of the first stanza of the Sin Sin Ming. Okay? Life is not difficult for those who hold no preferences. That's the first stanza of the Sin Sin Ming. A man is not called wise because he talks and talks again, but if he is peaceful, loving, and fearless, then he is in truth and called wise. No one can save us but ourselves. No one can, and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. To live a pure, unselfish life, one must count nothing as one's own in the midst of abundance. If we fail to look after others when they need help, who will look after us? One who acts on truth is happy in this world and beyond. Now, a side note here, this is not the id's truth the Buddha was talking about. I like this one. This is one I really love. Wear your ego like a loose-fitting garment. Picture yourself going to the beach on a really warm, sunny, beautiful day, and you're wearing your swimsuit and this old baggy t-shirt and flip-flops, and you get to the water and you rip off that loose-fitting garment, that t-shirt, and you jump in the water. Wear your ego like that, something you can easily remove, rip up. I really like that one. What you are is what you have been. What you'll be is what you do now. When watching after yourself, you watch after others. When watching after others, you watch after yourself. There is nothing so disobedient as an undisciplined mind, and there is nothing so obedient as a disciplined mind. Irrigators channel waters. Fletchers straighten bows. Carpenters bend wood. The wise master themselves. If you knew what I know about the power of giving, you would not let a single meal pass without sharing it in some way. The root of all suffering is attachment. Silence the angry man with love. Silence the ill-natured man with kindness. Silence the miser with generosity. Silence the liar with truth. Even as a solid rock is unshaken by the wind, so are the unwise unshaken by praise or blame. Now I want to dwell on this one for just a little bit. Even as a solid rock is unshaken by the mind, so are the wise unshaken by praise. If somebody says, "Wow, you are so awesome, you really rock, yeah," you should not be shaken by that. You just accept it for what it is in the moment and you move on. Ah, man, you are horrible. That was horrible. Yeah, that was the worst thing I've ever seen. You really suck, man. That should not shake you. That should simply be noted. It is as it is. It does not represent you. It's an opinion, which is why I really like this next one. People with opinions just go around bothering each other. I love that. People with opinions just go around bothering each other. Oh my gosh. Understanding is the heartwood of well-spoken words. Ceasing to do evil, cultivating the good, purifying the heart. This is the teaching of the Buddha. Now, this is just a very, very small sampling of what the Buddha has to say about diminishing the ego and enhancing the moral direction of the superego. As we look at this concept of ego, it is easy to see why the Buddha placed so much emphasis on diminishing the ego, this servant of the id. So, how then does this all fit into the concept of social justice? We have seen that the id has no concept of the other, and that the ego is just a small upgrade from the id. Trying its best to manage the id's desires without suffering negative personal and/or social consequences. The superego is the first hint we see of concern for morality and other individuals beside ourselves. What we do here at the Grand Rapids Buddhist Temple and Zen Center is entirely focused on two things: the teaching of the timeless and true Dharma, and to work diligently for the benefit of all sentient beings. Now, the operative word here is all sentient beings, all, not a select few depending on how we feel at any given point in time. All sentient beings using the Dharma to help ferry them across to the other shore, which is enlightenment. No exceptions. All sentient beings. Now, it's easy to get hung up. A lot of us, many members of the Sangha, get hung up on social issues, and they even bristle at the mention of Black Lives Matter. Some at the mention of White Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. Others really admonish, and I'm talking about strong admonishment of the Dharma Council, the Dharma teachers, for even mentioning social justice. What we hear is, just stick to the Dharma. Knock off all this social justice bullshit. Well, for all those who think that way, I've got a newsflash for you. I don't think you've read your Dhammapada. And my suggestion is that you get it off the freaking shelf, dust it off, and read it 3 times in a row. If you do that, you will find that the Buddha never shied away from social issues and frequently involved himself in social issues and had much to say about the roles of everyone from the lowest caste to kings and emperors. You see, we forget our purpose as Buddhists on the path, and we get too hung up on things like too far to the left or too far to the right. When it comes to the benefit of all sentient beings, there is no left or right. Just the persons who are suffering right now, right in front of us, as a result of injustice and immoral actions. Right now, there is no such thing as the United States of America. Truly, we are the deeply divided states of America. And there is a long and frightening reality to the way that African American individuals have been treated from the time we began accumulating colonies way back in the 1600s, all the way up to April 11th, 2021. That's today, for those of you who don't have your calendars. Now, the original method of policing began in the early 1700s with what was called the slave patrols. And I quote here, the slave patrols here's what they were: to establish a system of terror in response to slave uprisings with the capacity to pursue, apprehend, and return runaway slaves to their owners, including the use of excessive force to control and produce desired slave behavior. They were empowered to use forcible entry into any home based on even a suspicion of protecting runaway slaves. These patrols continued until the end of the Civil War. Now I'm going to switch sources and quote the FBI's criminal justice sheet because there's no way that paraphrasing this can do it any justice at all. Following the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, slave patrols were replaced by militia-style groups who were empowered to control and deny access to equal rights to freed slaves that looked to join the workforce and integrate with society. Their work included the enforcement of black codes, strict local and state laws that regulated and restricted access to labor, wages, voting rights, and general freedoms of formerly enslaved people. In 1868, the ratification of the 14th Amendment technically granted equal protections by laws of constitutional rights to African Americans, essentially meant to abolish black codes. Shortly after the abolishment of black codes, Jim Crow laws and state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation were enacted. Jim Crow laws looked to vanquish all protected rights of African Americans. By the 1900s, local municipalities began to construct police departments to enforce local laws in the areas of the East Coast and Midwest, including Jim Crow laws. Local municipalities leaned on police to enforce and exert excessive brutality on African Americans who violated any Jim Crow law. Jim Crow laws, now remember, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. Jim Crow laws continued through the end of the 1960s. Let that sink in. Since then, African American communities have continued to be under surveillance and targeted by police, including but not limited to the era of war on drugs and mass incarceration. That's straight from the FBI's report. Now, on December 28, 2020, the population of the United States was approximately 60.1% white, 15.5% Hispanic, 12.1% Black. In all races, there were 10,085,210 criminal acts committed. 2,667,010 of those, 7,014,550 of those criminal acts were committed by white individuals. 2,667,010 were committed by Black individuals. 224,200 were committed by American Indians. And 159,450 were committed by the Asian population. An FBI report at the same time, based on the statistics from 800 jurisdictions across the United States, indicated that in arrests according to race, blacks were arrested at a rate of 5 to 1. In an examination of 200 of those jurisdictions, arrests were reported as blacks over whites by a margin of 10 to 1, taking into account the demographics for the communities served. So, when we as a Dharma council, the Dharma teachers at the Grand Rapids Buddhist Temple and Zen Center, say that Black Lives Matter, we're not talking out of our rear ends here. When we say that all lives matter with the same gravity, we say that all lives matter with the very same gravity we say Black Lives Matter. We've got a very, very broken system that goes back long before we were a nation, and despite all the laws put in place for protection, it appears that injustice is still in the lead. As I was preparing this Dharma talk, which went through about 15 revisions, something came to mind to me, and it was something that I learned as a kid growing up in a Protestant Sunday school. And I'm sure many of you who grew up in Sunday school remember this little song we learned that I think we should incorporate with our morning chants, but it's probably not going to happen. And I sort of changed the words around. Buddha loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Buddha loves the little children of the world. Now, I think I could just as easily sing that song, Robert and Nathan love the children, or Ellen and Peter love the children. It is our mandate to know that Black lives matter, white lives matter, red lives matter, yellow lives matter, LGBTQ lives matter. Those with physical, emotional, and mental challenges matter. The guy we see, or the 2 or 3 or 4 guys we see every Sunday coming to the temple on the freeway overpass matters. All sentient beings matter. All lives matter, and it is our job to work in whatever ways we are capable for the benefit of all lives. To deviate from that mandate is to stray from the path. To stray from the path is not the Buddha way. So, as you go from your screens today, your computer screens, and continue your Sunday as it is, remember our mandate. If what we do is not for the benefit of all sentient beings, it is truly unworthy of the path. May you be well on your journey and remember what truly matters. We will close with the closing gathas. For all unskillful action ever committed by me since of old, on account of my beginningless greed, anger, and ignorance, born of my body, mouth, and thoughts, now I atone for them all. Vast is the robe of compassion, a formless field of benefaction. I wear the Buddhist teachings for the benefit of all sentient beings. All beings, one body, I vow to liberate. Endless blind passions, I vow to uproot. Dharma gates without number, I vow to penetrate. The great way of Buddha, I vow to attain.